You would never guess May's age. She maintains a collagen-rich face, beautiful appearance, and graceful figure. Her age-reversing secret lies within her unique recipe. One day, Mrs. Lee, dressed in luxurious attire, stepped out of her car. In an unfamiliar neighborhood, she walked up the stairs and arrived at a door. May welcomed Mrs. Lee inside and immediately recognized her as a former well-known actress. May challenged Mrs. Lee to guess her real age while tidying up. Mrs. Lee assumed May was in her 30s, as there wasn't a single wrinkle on her face. In reality, May is much older, her youthful appearance being living proof of her dumpling recipe. May began her craft, kneading the dough from scratch and chopping pork and eggs for the filling. Knowing it was Mrs. Lee's first time, May added cabbage to conceal any unpleasant odors. Anxious, Mrs. Lee didn't look into the kitchen. Instead, she was amused by May's old photos. Soon, freshly made dumplings with thin, translucent skin were ready. Mrs. Lee hesitated before eating, her expression showing discomfort. She dropped the first dumpling. May encouraged her to take it slowly, explaining all the benefits and claiming these were the best dumplings. Not wasting any precious food, May casually stuffed the dropped dumpling into a plant pot. May gently reminded Mrs. Lee to think about the results, not where the ingredients came from. Thinking about what had brought her there, Mrs. Lee nervously took another bite, chewing with a crispy, crunchy sound. May sang and performed for her client while Mrs. Lee savored the dumplings, enduring her fears as sweat dripped down her neck. Due to renovations, Mr. Lee has been staying at the hotel for a couple of months. He casually flirts with the masseuse, Kiki. Mr. Lee regularly consumes balut, a fertilized bird egg known for its aphrodisiac properties. Meanwhile, Mrs. Lee anxiously watches their interactions from the hotel room. At a hospital in Shenzhen, an elderly nurse discreetly handed May something, warning May there are reporters sniffing around lately and not to come by frequently even if there are clients. After completing the transaction, she heads back to Hong Kong. At the customs checkpoint, she was stopped by the police who wanted to inspect her red thermo. The X-ray scan showed nothing unusual. They asked her to open it, revealing a meal. The TV was playing a youth idol drama in which a young Mrs. Lee had starred. She had been a popular and rising actress. May had recorded these shows to play for Mrs. Lee, but she turned them off. May discovered that Mrs. Lee didn't have children. Mrs. Lee was uncertain whether the issue was with her or her husband. Mrs. Lee cautiously asked if there was a quicker method with premium ingredients. May's interest was immediately piqued. She explained that the best option would be a fetus at 5 months old, extracted using a drainage method by puncturing a cystic fluid sac. At that stage, human features are developed with high nutritional value and the best rejuvenating effects. The taste is tender and delicious. The water in the kitchen began to boil. May hurried in, and soon the sharp, rhythmic sound of chopping filled the room. Mrs. Lee quietly approached the wall, but May suddenly emerged, holding a fetus. Mrs. Lee quickly turned away, while May calmly explained that she had once been a top gynecologist, renowned for her impeccable surgical skills, performing procedures without any bloodshed. Soon, Mrs. Lee began devouring the dumplings, one after another, without daring to look into the bowl. She continued to return to May's place for more of her rejuvenating dumplings. Meanwhile, Mr. Lee was cheating with Kiki. Mrs. Lee called to remind him of their upcoming anniversary. However, Mr. Lee will be away for a business trip. Instead, he generously gave Mrs. Lee a check with many zeros. Over time, Mrs. Lee became accustomed to the taste of the dumplings, but one day she noticed that the filling was a bit tough. May reassured her it was made with a 2-month-old fetus and promised to mince it finer next time. Mrs. Lee looked in the mirror, disappointed not to see any significant results. She urged May to find higher quality ingredients. A mother and daughter arrived at May's place through a referral. They requested an abortion for the teenager. May initially refused, but the mother insisted, saying they couldn't afford the procedure at a hospital. May examined the girl's belly and pinched her swollen calf. The girl was already 5 months pregnant, and the baby had taken form in the womb. Any mistake during the procedure could easily lead to massive bleeding. May knew this was something she wouldn't dare do in Hong Kong, where such surgeries are illegal. The girl was only 15 years old. The mother cried and begged May, explaining that the pregnancy was from a despicable assault by the girl's father. One day, in a hotel, Mrs. Lee overheard her husband talking to another woman. She decided to follow the mistress to the streetcar. May spotted Mrs. Lee on the street and, worried, followed her back to the family mansion that was still under construction. At the mansion, Mrs. Lee dropped Mr. Lee's balut eggs, stomping on all of them. A hatched bird suddenly chirped, and Mrs. Lee stepped on it. May complimented the beautiful house, but Mrs. Lee was insistent. She urged May to find a premium ingredient immediately. Mrs. Lee reminisced about her younger days when she started acting after middle school and quickly gained fame. Mr. Lee, an investor in one of her dramas, began dating when she was 20 and he was 30. He treated her well. She used to be happy. May, she believed Mrs. Lee would never leave Mr. Lee, as she was accustomed to her life. After that day, May visited the mother of the pregnant girl again. Mrs. Lee called to reassure her about the premium ingredient. Thus, a delicate gynecological procedure took place on the broken sink in May's home. With her skillful hands, May used the drainage method, puncturing a cystic fluid sac to ensure the fetus came out whole and in perfect form. The girl endured 18 hours of agony until her water finally broke. She was covered in cold sweat, breathing rapidly, and still seemed to be in immense pain. May quickly took the fetus away and placed it in the refrigerator, then helped the girl to rest in her living room. Mrs. Lee hurried to May's house, following the clanging sounds coming from the kitchen. Driven by curiosity, she peeked into the kitchen for the first time and saw May taking out the premium ingredient. She screamed in horror and ran out immediately. Unfazed by Mrs. Lee's reaction, May sat calmly in the living room. Reaching the busy street below, Mrs. Lee stopped running. After some thought, she turned back and retraced her steps. May stood in front of a mirror, admiring her figure and youthful appearance. When Mrs. Lee returned, May was not surprised. They gazed at the premium ingredient, and May explained that it took 18 hours of meticulous work to obtain in its pure form. An extremely rare 5-month-old male fetus from a young, healthy mother's firstborn. In a firm tone, Mrs. Lee urged May to prepare the delicacy right away. Without fear, she watched the entire process. Soon, a plate of delicate pink dumplings was served before Mrs. Lee. She elegantly raised her chopsticks, enjoying them with an expression of pure bliss. Just then, her phone rang. Learning her husband had injured his leg, Mrs. Lee immediately rushed home. On the way, she stuck her head out of the window, smiling for the first time in a long while. Upon returning home, Mr. Lee, still recuperating, looked at his wife with newfound desire. Taking in the fragrance from her body, he seemed suddenly rejuvenated. Little did Mrs. Lee know how quickly the dumplings would work. Meanwhile, after the procedure, the girl began bleeding uncontrollably on the bus. Her mother helped her off. 2 men who sat in their previous seats found one of their pants quickly soaked with blood. After getting off the bus, the young girl suddenly fainted on the street, and her mother cried in regret. The next morning, Mrs. Lee woke up and touched her smooth skin with a smile on her face, while Mr. Lee secretly admired her in the kitchen, unable to get enough of her. Mrs. Lee hosted a lavish dinner. The guests secretly gossiped about her sudden youthful appearance, debating what procedure she might have had done. The party was in full swing, with laughter and chatter filling the air. The women marveled at Mrs. Lee's radiant appearance. As Mrs. Lee joined the ladies at the table, the guests noticed a heavy scent of raw meat. Feeling an itch on her neck, Mrs. Lee subtly smelled her hand and excused herself. The guest commented that the scent had disappeared. Hiding in the bathroom, Mrs. Lee felt nauseous. She soaked herself in the tub and called May, questioning whether the baby had been ill. The conversation was overheard by Mr. Lee. May casually confessed that it was an illegitimate child. Otherwise, where would she find such a rare ingredient? She suggested that perhaps this was why it worked so miraculously. Mrs. Lee watched her younger self on TV and broke down in tears. May confronted her, urging her to focus on her newfound beauty. After all, it had worked. Mr. Lee arrived in an unfamiliar neighborhood. He knocked on May's door, surprising her with his sudden visit. Mr. Lee warned May about her illegal business, then asked if it actually worked. May warmly invited him in, expressing her intention to entertain him properly. Mr. Lee sat in the same seat his wife had before. May, as usual, served tea, subtly guiding the conversation. She spoke of historical medicinal books and stories, saying, "Flesh heals flesh. If the purpose is achieved, it doesn't violate ethics," and served him her special dumplings. Mr. Lee ate May's dumplings with a casual demeanor, more naturally than his wife had. Before he could finish the dumplings, May's deliberate movements and alluring figure ignited a desire in him. Within moments, his passion flared up, but just then, he noticed a photograph on the wall. The picture was clearly dated 1960. Doing the math, Mr. Lee realized that May would now be over 60 years old. He froze in place briefly, but was quickly reassured by May's persuasive words. "Meat is just meat, only the exterior." At that moment, Mrs. Lee called May, urgently asking for more dumplings. May glanced at the phone and then at the man across from her, finally tossing the phone aside. After reluctantly sending Mr. Lee away, Mrs. Lee, with her head wrapped in a scarf, arrived shortly after. She knocked on May's door continuously, but there was no response. The next morning, May appeared even more youthful and radiant. Meanwhile, Mrs. Lee looked worn out as she sat despondently in the hospital. The doctor couldn't find any illness in her. In the hallway, she heard a familiar voice nearby. Mrs. Lee quickly hid and listened in. It was Kiki, the mistress who was pregnant. She broke down in tears. Desperate, Mrs. Lee sought help from May, but May refused the check and stated she was retired now. Mr. Lee called shortly after, and May gladly picked up the phone, excited to see him again. She quickly ripped up Mrs. Lee's check and tossed the pieces into the air. Police received a report. They rushed to a crime scene. At the entrance, the mother of the pregnant daughter was covered in blood, seated on the doorstep. After losing her daughter, the mother had taken up the knife against her monstrous husband, gravely injuring him. Upon hearing this news, May quickly packed her bags, grabbed her pet dog, and fled overnight. The police searched May's empty home. She left most belongings behind. May's phone rang. A detective answered the call, but no one spoke. Mrs. Lee stands across from the unit and quickly hangs up. 3 months later, in a cafe, Mrs. Lee arranged to meet her husband's mistress, Kiki. Their first meeting was surprisingly calm. In the end, doubling the money prevailed. At 5-month pregnancy, Mrs. Lee accompanies Kiki to the abortion. She instructed the doctor to use May's method to extract the fetus intact. The doctor warned that it would be a long and painful process for the patient. Kiki curiously asked if Mrs. Lee intended to make a mount. Mrs. Lee smirks, insists on watching the entire process. While waiting for the surgery to finish, a rough and weary woman was in Shenzhen, carrying a heavy burden on her shoulder, humming an old song. In Mrs. Lee's hands, she held what she considered an incredibly precious specimen. After staring at it for a long time, she brought down a knife. For upcoming content, click like, pound that subscribe, and hit notification. Thank you for watching.